All right, let's talk about Napoleon's Spanish Ulcer. It's a fascinating term he coined himself, right? It sounds kind of small, like a minor annoyance. But this was anything but. This ulcer festered and grew, and it ended up draining his empire of its strength, helping to bring the whole thing crashing down. We're going to unpack how this war of resistance in Spain turned into one of the biggest military blunders of the century. I want to start with just one number, 17,000. Just let that sink in. This isn't the total killed in a long campaign. No, this is the number of Napoleon's soldiers who were taken prisoner after a single battle. For an army that seemed unbeatable, losing this many men in one fell swoop wasn't just a loss, it was a complete and utter humiliation.
And that really brings us to the big question here, doesn't it? How on earth did this army, this supposedly invincible force that had steamrolled its way across Europe, get so thoroughly humbled in Spain? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of arrogance, pure deception, and a brand new kind of warfare that the French were totally unprepared for. So let's zoom in on that moment, the exact point where the myth of French invincibility just shattered. We need to talk about the Battle of Belen. You know, before July 1808, the very idea of a whole French army just laying down its weapons, it was laughable. I mean, these guys had dominated Austria, Prussia, Russia, you name it. But then, in the brutal summer heat of southern Spain, the unthinkable happened. And let me tell you, the news of this defeat sent shockwaves across the entire continent. And if you just look at the raw data, the story becomes crystal clear. The French army here, these weren't the battle-hardened veterans from his greatest victories. No, they were mostly young, inexperienced conscripts. Napoleon figured they were good enough for what he called a simple military promenade. But they were up against a larger, fiercely motivated Spanish army. The result? A completely lopsided disaster with that just staggering number of French prisoners. So, you have to ask, how did the French army even wander into this trap? Well, it was all part of Napoleon's huge and, as it turns out, fatally flawed, strategic plan for Spain. The whole thing was a masterclass in deception, really. It all started with him wanting to punish Portugal for trading with Britain. So he sweet-talked Spain into a treaty, allowing his troops to march through for a joint invasion. But here's the trick. Once his troops were inside Spain, they just never left. They used the alliance as a cover, seizing crucial fortresses, taking over Madrid, and then, bam, the final move. He kicks out the Spanish king and puts his own brother, Joseph, on the throne. Napoleon genuinely thought he'd just conquered an entire country without firing a single shot.
This quote, it says everything you need to know about his mindset. He was so wrong. He looked at Spain and saw a weak government, a royal family in chaos. What he didn't see, what he completely failed to account for, was the incredible pride of the Spanish people. He thought this would be quick and cheap, a walk in the park. It turned out to be anything
because the Spanish people didn't just roll over. Their reaction wasn't a formal declaration of war. Oh, no. It was something totally different, something messy and brutal, and it literally gave us a new word for how to fight a war. They called it the guerrilla, the little war. This wasn't about armies lining up on a battlefield. This was about everyone, farmers, priests, you name it, picking up whatever weapons they could find and turning the occupation into a living nightmare for the French. They'd hit supply convoys, ambush patrols, intercept messengers, anything to disrupt the invaders. And this quote from an officer fighting for the French, it just perfectly captures the psychological terror of it all. I mean, how do you even fight an enemy like that? An enemy that can just melt back into the crowd or disappear into the hills they've known their entire lives. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, a war of constant fear that just shredded French morale. And that's the key. That's the heart of the ulcer. It was this relentless, grinding, painful conflict that never, ever healed. It was a wound that just kept bleeding his empire of its most precious resources, men, money, and morale, for 6 incredibly long years. But here's what made the situation a complete nightmare for the French. They weren't just fighting these shadowy guerrillas. It was way more complicated than that. They were actually trapped between two very different and very dangerous enemies. So on one side, you have the little war, the guerrilla war fought in the shadows. But on the other, you had a full-blown conventional war. This was led by a combined army of British, Portuguese, and Spanish regulars under the command of the tactical genius Sir Arthur Wellesley, who you probably know as the Duke of Wellington. The French were caught in the middle.
They couldn't focus all their strength on crushing the guerrillas because Wellington's army would attack, and they couldn't focus on Wellington because the guerrillas would just tear up their supply lines from behind. And Wellington, well, he had an ace up his sleeve, a masterpiece of military engineering called the Lines of Torres Vedras. Think of it as a massive, multi-layered defensive system of forts and obstacles that made the city of Lisbon practically impossible to capture. It was his fortress, his safe zone. He could always retreat there, get resupplied by the British Navy, and then wait for the perfect moment to strike, all while the guerrillas kept bleeding the French white all across Spain. So you add it all up, this shocking defeat at Bailén, the unending guerrilla war, and this impossible two-front trap. What you get is a slow-acting poison that started to cripple the entire Napoleonic Empire. The final bill for this ulcer was just catastrophic. Militarily, Spain became a black hole for soldiers, sucking in hundreds of thousands of troops that Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere, especially for his disastrous invasion of Russia. Financially, it was a money pit, but maybe the biggest hit was to his reputation. The resistance in Spain proved to the rest of Europe that the emperor was not invincible. He could be beaten, he could be bled. And this chart really puts it into perspective. Just look at the sheer number of troops France had to pour into Spain. Over 300,000 at its peak. Now think about that. A small, scattered force of partisans helping Wellington's army was effectively neutralizing a massive chunk of what was then the most powerful army in the world.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. Everyone points to the invasion of Russia in 1812 as the thing that truly destroyed Napoleon. And it was a catastrophe. But you have to ask yourself, would Russia have been so fatal if Napoleon wasn't already bleeding out in Spain? Would it have been so disastrous if he'd had another 200,000 or 300,000 veteran troops with him, instead of them being bogged down fighting phantoms in the Spanish mountains? The Spanish ulcer didn't just hurt Napoleon's empire, it weakened it, drained it, and maybe, just maybe, made its final collapse inevitable.